Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Dracut Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Sonya Larson, interim pastor and teacher at the First Congregational Church of Southampton, UCC, Quentin Chin, and ASL interpreter Rich. We are discussing Asian Americans and the racism that affects Asian immigrants and descendants. Sonya, how has this impacted you and your writing?
Yes, I'm happy to speak about that. And it's very important that we talk about racism faced by Asian Americans, especially right now. As many of you know, on March 16th of this year, there was a horrific attack targeting Asian American women and women of Asian descent in Atlanta, Georgia. And I feel that between that awful incident and the increase in violence and hate speech against Asian Americans during this COVID pandemic has really brought this issue to the fore. But I want to point out that so long as there have been Asian immigrants in America, and as long as there have been descendants of Asians in America, we have faced discrimination, we have faced violence against us, and we have faced hate speech. And it is getting more attention right now, and we are seeing it on the rise. But this has always been with us. Um, I myself am half Chinese, and I identify as mixed race Asian American. And so I am privy to some of the particular stereotypes about Asian Americans that very much live on. And I also have a mixed race experience, which has its own set of stereotypes. But I'll say that one thing that one stereotype that needs to be broken down is that of the model minority of Asian Americans, being that we are all successful in school and good at math and of a higher socioeconomic class, and that we don't face discrimination, and that we don't face racism, and that we don't face people who would treat us differently based on our racial experience or on how we look. And I cannot emphasize how untrue that is. The Asian American community in America is very diverse, um, uh, based on country of origin, based on socioeconomic status, and so on. And I think that especially Asian Americans who are of a lower socioeconomic status, especially those who are first generation, they don't get the kinds of attention that those who fall under the model minority myth do. So that's one that I think really masks what Asian Americans face, and is kind of used to hold up Asian Americans against other people of color, mainly Black Americans, Latinx Americans, to say, look, Asian Americans, they made it in the society. They're succeeding in all these ways. Why can't these groups do that? So it's really a weapon, as I see it, of white supremacy that has been used for decades now, and that thankfully a lot of people are trying to break down. There's a lot more that I could say. I'll say I personally have certain, sort of painful to go through these experiences, but I might as well share them here, because where else, if not here? I, for example, have walked down the street and had people, total strangers who don't know me, pull their eyelids like this and sort of say mocking things about how I look, pertaining to my Asianness. I've been called a chink, and other derogatory terms. My twin brother has he was physically assaulted after being called a chink by someone walking down the street, and still bears a scar on his face from that incident. So those are some of the real experiences I've had. In addition to that, in being mixed race, I think a lot of people who are mixed race know well the experience of being asked, what are you? Are you a hybrid? You are the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds. I think anytime that the way you look is not easily categorized in this country. You can become a subject of fascination, for better or for worse, and that's certainly something I've experienced. So that's a sort of broad overview of where I come from when I think about the subject. Quentin, I'm really curious to hear about your experience too, to the extent that you want to share that with us.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Sonya. And Diane, Tom, thank you for asking me to be here too, to share the stories. I think I want to take off on the model minority piece, which, so on a real practical level, there's I don't know where the lawsuit is right now. There was a case in the last year or so against Harvard, right? I don't know if everyone's familiar with this case or not. This is, it was brought up, so it was basically a case to suing Harvard for discriminating against Asians in its admission policies, right? That the question is, so Asians, and this kind of plays into the model, the Asian, the model minority, and that because Asians, well, there's a part of Asian culture too, I know at least in Chinese culture, that particularly immigrant parents would really want to see their children succeed. And to succeed is also to go to some of the finest universities in the country, which would be one of them being Harvard. And so the lawsuit points out that there were many Asians that were denied admission because even though they had the grades and everything else, and Harvard's making the claim that we do need to strive for diversity. And the thing is, it was the cynical ploy actually put forward by, and I can't remember his name, but he was basically a white guy who was really seeking to dismantle affirmative action altogether. But he's doing this as basically weaponizing Asians against other minorities. So that's sort of this cynical manipulation that we sometimes will have to deal with. As for me, I'm Chinese, both my parents Chinese. I grew up in this, my parents were born in this country. I was born in 54, so
good year to be
take
born.
it for what it's worth. I mean, growing up, well, yeah, I mean, we're there. Well, some of us are there. but growing up, it was, so my parents were born in Chinatown, New York's Chinatown. And so they're the first generation to leave Chinatown and move out to the suburbs. And, in those days, I mean, things that we sort of take for granted, things like tofu, which is sort of like normal, right? In fact, the New York Times today had a recipe which used silken tofu with tomatoes and peaches as sort of a take on a caprese salad, right? Well, back then there was no such thing as tofu in China, in Western markets, supermarkets, and I would get things like this. People would come up to me and say, "Hey, Quentin, we had Chinese food last night for dinner," and which was sort of like, okay, but I had Chinese food last night. I'm probably going to have Chinese food tonight, and I'm probably going to eat Chinese food for most of the week here. And then I'd ask them what they'd have, and then they'd tell me, well, we had chicken chow mein or something, and I'm like, I don't even know what that is, right? And so I would go home and I'd ask about this, and my mother would tell me, no, no, not, it's not. And I do remember one time, so my dad sometimes worked late, and so one day my mom actually bought chicken chow mein. This is the crap out of the can.
Oh,
and she fed it to us, and we were just like, what is this? And like she said, this is what your friends call Chinese food, and that's so there was a whole ignorance about being Chinese. And as far as, to me, and after meeting me and listening to me for a bit, they honestly, they would say, wow, you speak so well. You speak English really well, which I kind of want to say good thing, because it's the only language I know. For me, the other thing is that in the United Church of Christ, which is still a predominantly white denomination, I am typically the only person of color in most of the congregations I enter. And so that also brings up, so the question of immigration, for instance, is one that, which is currently playing out in this country. When I have preached on immigration, I begin with telling the story of my mother's, well, actually my mother's stepfather, who came over under a paper name, and I don't know if I should define what paper name is. I mean, is that clear to?
Yes, please.
Sonya, okay. Yeah, so, okay. So, and I point out that for Chinese immigration, there were many of us. I mean, in my age, I would say everyone of my generation knows at least someone, or is even related to someone who came over with a paper name.
So tell us what that is, because some people won't know.
And so I talk about that when I talk about. Oh, okay. So what it was paper names. So 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the only act of Congress that specifically named a people not to come into the United States, that barred from the entry into the United States, except for certain categories. And these categories typically were if you had a family member in the United States, because bear in mind, prior to 1882, the Chinese were coming over. There were reasons to put in the Exclusion Act, which I won't go into. But what wound up happening is that, so people who wanted to come to the United States, Chinese who wanted to come, would in essence buy a name of a family member who's already here. They're not in your family, but they will buy that name. And there would be a book that you would receive that talked about the whole family in great detail. And as you're coming over on the ship, you would study this. And before you entered the United States, you would destroy this book. But you would come in, and your last name, your birth name, would not necessarily be your immigration name.
Yeah.
So my different last name on his immigration from his birth name. And that was pretty standard in many Chinese families. A different story I can tell is that of my mom's father, who I never met because he died young. He got his undergraduate degree at Columbia University and a medical degree at Yale. He could not get any residency in New York State.
Why?
And because he was Chinese. And it took a friend of the family, who was a federal judge, to, in essence, get him a residency in northern New Jersey. So my mom's dad, by family story, is apparently the first medical doctor of Chinese descent in New York State.
Yeah.
So it's been there, right? It's long-standing, and it still goes on in different ways.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you shared your story, Quentin, and laid out the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, because a lot of people don't know about it, even though it was this tremendously discriminatory and powerful act that barred Chinese people from coming to the country. And my grandfather was also a paper son. He came into this country under a false name. He went by that false name his whole life. And he is buried under that false name. And it breaks my heart to think that that's what it took to enter this country. And just as one small piece of evidence among many of how hard it was for Chinese people then, and very much still is in ways that we don't talk about. When my grandfather had kids, he named his son George Washington. Like literally George Washington, he named them George Washington. And he named his daughters Anne and Rosemary. He picked like the most American sounding names that he knew of, because he knew that if he gave his children also had Chinese names, but he wanted for them to have very American sounding, very white sounding names for non-Chinese people to interact with, because he thought that will give them at least some protection from the discrimination that he was facing. And a lot of new immigrants do this. Some take a different tack and say, no, like we're going to put our foot down and be proud of our culture, et cetera. It's like a very complex set of decisions to make just around this one thing, naming your children. But that shows you just what they were up against, to say like, I'm gonna name my Chinese American boy George Washington. That's my uncle.
Wow.
And yes, I mean, it's easy to talk about these things as if they all happened in the past. There certainly was so much discrimination and violence against Chinese immigrants and their descendants in the past, but it very much is happening now. It's on the rise now, and we need to talk about it. If there's one good thing that's come out of this last year of so much pain, it's that there is more of an interest among non-Asian Americans to learn about this, to talk about it, and to speak up if they see it. You needn't look any further than the early days of the pandemic, when Chinatowns all across the country were being vacated. Nobody would go to Asian-owned restaurants, never mind whether they were Chinese-owned, just Asian-owned, period. These restaurants were empty. People didn't want to eat them. They were afraid. And there, right there, that phenomenon of always feeling like you belong here until the shoe drops, until someone gets scared, until someone needs someone to blame, then Asian Americans are often one of the first groups pointed to, depending on the particular situation and context. And there you absolutely saw it. It's like people, whether they want to admit it or not, throughout America said, I'm afraid of Asian Americans. I'm afraid of being near them, and I'm afraid of eating in their restaurants and going to their businesses. So I'm just not going to go. And that's part and parcel of everything we're talking about now. Yeah, and I try to write about this in my own fiction, in my own way.
One of the things, and Sonya, you mentioned it. Sonya, you mentioned early on too about the shooting in Atlanta, and I think Diane and Tom, you read that essay. I don't know if, you read the essay I did for the Berkshire Eagle, which basically, because I remember I wrote, it was prompted because people were debating whether the shooting was anti-Asian racism or was it sexual fetishization. And I think this is another part of the strange dynamic of anti-Asian racism, is that particularly for Asian women, there is the fetishization and racism are tightly intertwined. It's almost like you can't really separate that out. There's an exoticism, there's just sort of this exoticism. And actually for Asian men, the other problem for Asian men is that there's also a feminine, we're all seen sort of effeminate. We're not seen as necessarily as masculine as our white counterparts.
I couldn't agree more. I wrote a short story actually a few years ago called Gay Dove that came out of these dating experiences I was having and being on various dating websites. And dating websites collect data, of course, on who shows an interest in whom. And the data coming out of OkCupid and Tinder and various sites is disturbingly clear. Among other racial trends that are obvious, one is that Asian women are highly sought after, and they're one of the sought after racial groups, and Asian men are one of the least sought after racial groups. And that 100% stems from what Quentin is saying right now about stereotypes, in that Asian women are fetishized, exoticized, which is another way of saying not seen as real people. And Asian men are also dismissed and not seen as masculine, not seen as suitable partners, which is to say not seen as real people either. And that, you know, that very much lives on. And I don't see a whole lot of efforts in the national conversation that are turning that tide. That's been with us for a very long time. Yeah.
And I think one of the problems in the national conversation is that it's still, there's so much to unpack about racism in general, right? And I think for the people who have control over the narrative, which tends to be, let's face it, it's still most of the major institutions that disseminate information are owned by whites, right? And confronting some of the implicit aspects of racism that they even if professing that, you know, I'm not really racist. I mean, it's really hard to get past the sort of the stuff you've grown up with too, and the stories that you know that these people controlling the narrative have heard as well. I mean, I'm just, for what it's worth, just before coming on here, I've been working on my sermon for Sunday, which I'm actually, and it has nothing to do with racism per se, but I'm dealing with the story of David and Bathsheba, and looking at it from a feminist perspective, in that there's so the author Cheryl Exum, who wrote this book, Fragmented Women, pointed out that Bathsheba was actually in a literary center. She was, and so what I'm saying here is that there's a visible and an invisible side to people, and it's the invisible side. It's only when we lift it up that we can make people aware of some of the pain and all this stuff that's underneath. And so, Sonya, thank you for your writing on this stuff to make clear that there is this very dark underside of pain that that we have to lift up, because I guess in the end, it's really kind of up to us to keep making people aware, and it hurts.
Yeah, well, thank you, Quentin, for your sermons. They sound wonderful and really illuminating. And if there's one thing that gives me hope, is that, like you say, it's very, historically, it's very much been on the shoulders of Asians and Asian Americans to point out and describe, and in a way keep reliving the painful experiences that they've had, in order to make them known to people, in order to prevent them from happening again or happening to other people. I do feel some hope in the last year that that fellow white Americans, fellow Americans who aren't Asian, are recognizing their own role in taking this work on themselves and saying, wait a minute, I have to take some time to educate myself. I have to take some time to self-reflect and be able to point out harmful things when I see them without waiting for Quentin or Sonya or like another Asian American to have to point it out themselves. And I just want everyone in the audience to know that that's really a courageous and wonderful thing to do. And every time you do it, we see you, like we see you and we appreciate it, and it saves us from the pain of having to go there again ourselves. And I have a lot to learn in my own life in terms of doing that for other people who don't have the privileges that I have. Like I want to be that person for them too. It requires first seeing the thing that you have not seen before. Like I feel that when it comes to talking about the privileges we have, the other side of the coin of privilege is a kind of blindness. It's you almost as if the definition of privilege is the ability to be able to walk through the world ignorant about something, and it doesn't cause you harm. It doesn't. No one is going to step on your toes for doing that. But so to start to reverse that process is to first see what you have not seen, and then get practiced about seeing it and being aware of it and speaking up about it. And it's scary. It's scary for me, at least initially, and I'm very much still learning. But once you get into the habit of it, it's not so scary, and you can see just how important it is. I have a little girl myself, little baby girl, and she's mixed race herself, and she's going to face some disadvantages in the world racially that I have not. And so I'm in this position both as her mother, but as someone who's just has some racial privileges that she doesn't. I want to make sure I'm really cognizant of and not dismissing of anything that she might encounter in the world out there. So I just want to make sure our audience hears that too.
It's a very difficult conversation, and it's a challenge to be insightful enough to see everything. So that's why I really appreciate both of you coming forward and sharing your personal stories and experiences. Hopefully this will help other people understand and know things. You can all come on September 25th at 2:00 to hear Sonya discuss her books and writing. She's our Dracut Arts event author that day. There will be an ASL interpreter present throughout the program to both sign her talk and your questions. Thank you both so much.
Yes, thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for asking. Really lovely. Thank you.